All right, we are about to dive into one of the most epic power struggles in all of Western history. We're talking about a conflict that pitted popes against emperors, and believe me, it completely changed the relationship between church and state forever.
I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel, right? But this actually happened. And the story of how one of the most powerful men in Europe was brought to his knees, well, that's the key to understanding the battle that really defined the entire Middle Ages.
So, how did we get to this point? Well, here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll set the stage with the two big powers of the era, the Pope and the King. Then we'll dig into the one issue that lit the fuse, the battle for investiture. After that, we get to the dramatic part, a king barefoot in the snow. We'll see how a shaky peace was finally made with the Concordat of Worms, and finally, we'll talk about the legacy, why this whole church versus state thing still matters. All right, first things first. To really understand this whole conflict, you have to get your head around the central tension of the medieval world. And it all boiled down to one single question. Who was really in charge?
You see, a popular idea back then was this thing called the two swords theory. Think of it like this. On one side, you've got the emperor. He's got the sword of secular, or, worldly power. He's the one with the armies, the land, the laws. Then, on the other side, you've got the pope. He holds the sword of spiritual power, guiding everyone on matters of faith and salvation. In theory, these two were supposed to be separate, but in reality, their worlds were constantly crashing into each other, creating this huge, messy gray area over who had the final say.
And that messy gray area, well, that's exactly where the powder keg was sitting, just waiting for a spark. And the fuse was lit by one very specific issue. And that issue was something called investiture. Now, it sounds kind of technical, but it's really about one question. Who gets to appoint bishops? Seems simple enough, right? Wrong. In the medieval world, this was everything. This was the ultimate power play.
So let's break down why this was such a big deal. For the emperor, it was all about control. See, bishops weren't just spiritual guides. They were basically powerful local rulers, major vassals. He needed loyal guys in those positions to help run his massive empire. And here's the clever part for him. Bishops couldn't have legitimate kids, so when they died, all that land and power went right back to the emperor. Super convenient. But for the pope, this was a spiritual nightmare. It meant kings were basically controlling the church, and a lot of reformers at the time were pushing hard, saying, no way, the church has to be pure, it has to choose its own leaders.
And this is where a big political debate gets super personal. It stops being about abstract ideas and becomes a showdown between two incredibly powerful, incredibly stubborn men, Pope Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. And things just spiraled out of control, like incredibly fast. Check this out. In early 1075, Pope Gregory says, no more lay investiture. By the end of that same year, Emperor Henry just ignores him and appoints his own guy. A month later, Henry calls Gregory a false pope. So what does Gregory do a month after that? He pulls out the biggest weapon he has. He excommunicates the emperor. And all of this leads to that crazy showdown at Canosso just 1 year later.
Yeah, Henry didn't just, disagree. He went on a full-blown attack. He sent this shocking message to Gregory, calling him a false pope and basically telling him to get out. This was a direct, unprecedented challenge to the pope's power. And Gregory's response? It was going to be absolute.
So Gregory excommunicates Henry, and you gotta understand, this wasn't just some spiritual timeout. No, excommunication was like a political nuclear bomb. It meant that all of Henry's subjects were suddenly free from their oath of loyalty to him. And those powerful German nobles, the ones who were already kind of looking for an excuse to rebel, this was the green light they were waiting for. All of a sudden, Henry's entire empire is about to fall apart.
Henry was completely backed into a corner. So, to save his throne, he did something nobody could have imagined. He crossed the Alps in the middle of winter and stood outside the castle of Canossa, barefoot, in the snow, for 3 straight days, begging the Pope to forgive him. I mean, can you picture it? It was the ultimate public humiliation and an absolutely stunning show of the Pope's power.
But here's the thing, the story doesn't end there. That incredible scene of the emperor in the snow, that was just one battle in a much, much longer war. This struggle went on for decades, with civil wars, people claiming to be the real pope, and a ton of bloodshed. A real solution was still a long, long way off.
Finally, after almost 50 years of this brutal conflict, the two sides came together in the German city of Worms. The year is 1122.
and they were finally ready to hammer out a deal.
And what they came up with was a compromise called the Concordat of Worms. So here's the deal. The emperor agrees to give up the right of investiture. From now on, the church gets to elect its own bishops. Sounds like a win for the pope, right? Well, here's the catch. The emperor still got to be there for the elections, and he still had the power to grant the bishops their land and secular authority. So he still had a ton of influence. It wasn't a total victory for either side, but it was a peace they could both live with.
Okay, so why are we talking about a fight that happened over 900 years ago? I mean, what's the big takeaway? What's the lasting impact of this whole epic struggle?
Well, because the Concordat of Worms was one of the very first times in European history that someone drew a formal line in the sand between the power of the church and the power of the state. It put forward this, at the time, radical idea that each one had its own lane, its own sphere of influence. And that concept, the separation of church and state, is a fundamental cornerstone of the modern Western world.
And that really leaves us with a final thought. This whole conflict, almost 1,000 years ago, was about drawing a line. But if you look around today, debates over where exactly that line should be drawn between faith and law and government, they're still happening all over the world. So it makes you wonder, is that line ever really truly clear?
Hey, thanks so much for joining us to unpack the investiture controversy. If you found this interesting, do us a favor and hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history, and definitely let us know what you think about that final question in the comments. We'll see you in the next one.